The sky turned dark over Chicago on a Tuesday morning. John Miller looked up from grading papers in his apartment and saw strange shapes blocking the sun. They were not clouds. They were ships, huge metal ships that seemed to stretch for miles. John, a history professor who studied ancient Scottish warfare, dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the floor, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the window, on the impossible sight in the sky. All across the world, the same scene played out. Giant ships appeared over every major city. New York, London, Tokyo, Beijing. They just hung there, silent and threatening. The president came on TV. He told everyone to stay calm. He said they were trying to talk to the visitors. But his voice shook. John could tell he was scared too. 3 days passed. The ships did nothing. People began to hope this was just some kind of peaceful first contact. Then the bottom of each ship opened up. Smaller craft poured out. They were sleek and fast, like metal insects. They flew down to the ground and landed. Doors opened, and the aliens came out. The Vex didn't look like anything from Earth. They had shiny bodies that seemed part metal, part rock. They walked on 4 legs and had 4 more limbs they used like arms. Their heads had no eyes that humans could recognize, just smooth surfaces that glowed with strange patterns. The military tried to fight. Tanks rolled into cities. Jets flew toward the ships. Nothing worked. The Vex had energy shields that stopped bullets. They had weapons that melted tanks. The jets were swatted from the sky like flies. Susan Wright sat in a dark room at the Pentagon, watching screens as reports came in from around the world. She was an analyst with a background in both military strategy and cultural anthropology. Her job was to find patterns, to understand the enemy. "They're avoiding these areas," she said, pointing to a map. Her finger traced over mountainous regions. "Look, the Rockies, the Alps, the Andes, and here, the Scottish Highlands. They've sent no ground forces there at all." Her boss, a general with tired eyes, shook his head. "They're just prioritizing population centers. They'll get to the rural areas eventually." But Susan wasn't convinced. She pulled up more data. "They've sent forces to remote areas in flat terrain. It's specifically mountains they're avoiding." Before she could investigate further, alarms blared through the building. "They've breached the perimeter," someone shouted. "Pentagon is compromised." Susan grabbed a hard drive with her research and ran. The Pentagon was supposed to be the most secure building in America. If it was falling, nowhere was safe. Back in Chicago, John watched from his window as the city fell. The Vex moved through the streets methodically. They didn't seem interested in killing humans for the sake of killing. Instead, they captured some and ignored others. They were looking for something. John's phone rang. It was his cousin Frank Campbell, who lived in rural Virginia. "John, you need to get out of the city," Frank said. "The countryside is safer. They're not pushing this hard out here." "How would I even get out?" John asked. "They're everywhere. They have patterns, gaps in their patrols. I've been watching, and I've been hearing things from other resistance groups forming up. These things, whatever they are, they can't seem to handle certain environments. They're vulnerable somehow." That night, John packed a small bag. He included an old book about Highland clan warfare that his grandfather had given him. It contained accounts of how the Scottish clans had resisted larger, better-equipped English armies for centuries, using the mountains to their advantage. As he slipped out of his apartment building into the darkness, he thought about history repeating itself. Humans were outmatched by the Vex technology, but humans had faced overwhelming odds before. They had found ways to fight back. He made it 3 blocks before a Vex patrol spotted him. John ran, his heart pounding. He ducked into an alley, then another. He could hear the mechanical sounds of the Vex following. He was trapped, with no way out. Then he heard gunfire. The Vex patrol fell. A woman emerged from the shadows. "Professor Miller?" she asked. "I'm Susan Wright, Pentagon analyst. We need to talk about Scotland. 3 months had passed since the Vex arrived. Most of Earth was under their control. They built large machines that dug into the ground, taking metals and minerals. They turned old human factories into new places where they made more of their own kind. John and Susan moved carefully through the ruins of what had once been a small town in Virginia. They were heading to meet Frank at a safe house. They had been on the run since Chicago, staying one step ahead of the Vex patrols. "You really think there's something to this Highland thing?" John asked as they walked. Susan nodded. "The data doesn't lie. The Vex avoid high elevations and certain types of terrain, especially in Scotland." They reached an old farmhouse where Frank was waiting. He had turned the basement into a command center for local resistance. Maps covered the walls. Radios sat on tables. About a dozen people worked there, monitoring Vex movements. "Glad you made it," Frank said, hugging his cousin. He looked at Susan. "So you're the analyst with the mountain theory." Susan showed Frank her data on a laptop. "It's more than a theory now. Look at these Vex troop movements. They've taken over every major city worldwide, but they've barely touched the Highlands in Scotland, or the High Rockies or the Andes." Frank scratched his beard. "But why? What's special about mountains?" John opened his old book about Highland warfare. "Maybe it's not just mountains. Maybe it's something about those specific places." A young man named Paul walked over. He had been a sound engineer before the invasion. "I've been picking up weird signals from the Vex," he said. "They communicate using some kind of frequency we can't hear." Susan looked up sharply. "Frequency?" Paul nodded. "Yeah, like sound waves, but not in our hearing range." John flipped through his book until he found a page about Highland bagpipes. The pipes were used in battle to coordinate troops, but also to frighten enemies. The sound carries for miles in mountain valleys. Susan moved to her computer quickly. "Paul, do you have recordings of the Vex communication frequencies?" Paul nodded and connected his device to her laptop. Together, they analyzed the Vex signals and compared them to recordings of Highland bagpipes Susan found online. "This is incredible," Susan said after an hour of work. "There's overlap in the frequency patterns. The bagpipes produce harmonics that interfere with what looks like Vex communication bands." "You're saying bagpipes might hurt these aliens?" Frank asked, looking skeptical. "Not just hurt them," Susan replied. "If they communicate the way I think they do, certain sounds might disrupt their entire nervous system." John remembered something else. The Vex bodies look silicon-based, not carbon-based like us. Silicon crystalline structures are sensitive to specific vibrations. They worked through the night, testing their theory with the limited data they had. By morning, they were convinced. "We need to get to Scotland," John said. "That's where we'll find the most people who know how to play traditional pipes, and it's where the Vex are least established." "Scotland." Frank shook his head. "How are we supposed to get across the Atlantic with aliens controlling everything?" Susan pulled up a map. "The Vex have taken over major ports and airports, but they're thinner along the main coastline. There are fishing communities that are still operating under the radar. We might find a boat." "And if this theory is wrong?" Frank asked. John closed his old book. "Then we've lost nothing. The resistance is barely hanging on as it is. We need a new approach." The decision was made. They would gather supplies and head north to Maine, then find a way across the ocean to Scotland. It was a desperate plan, but they had nothing else. As they packed to leave, Paul brought over something he had built. It looked like a small speaker. "I modified this to replicate bagpipe frequencies," he said. "It's not powerful, but it might give us a defense if we run into Vex patrols." John took the device. "What should we call this plan?" Susan thought for a moment. The Highlanders saved Scotland from invaders for centuries. Now they might save Earth. She smiled grimly. "Let's call it Operation Claymore." Getting to Scotland was harder than they had planned. It took John, Susan, and Paul 2 months to reach the coast of Maine. They moved mostly at night, hiding from Vex patrols during the day. Frank stayed behind to coordinate the resistance in Virginia. They found a small fishing village where people still lived free from Vex control. An old man named Greg owned a sturdy boat he used to fish. When he heard their plan, he agreed to take them across the Atlantic. My grandmother came from Scotland. He told them as they loaded supplies onto his boat, "If there's a chance to hurt these alien devils using bagpipes, I want to help." The ocean journey was long and dangerous. They had to avoid Vex ships that patrolled the waters. Once, they almost got caught in a storm, but after 23 days at sea, they finally saw land. "Scotland," John said, looking at the rocky coastline. His heart beat faster. "I hope we're right about this." They landed in a small, hidden cove. Greg promised to wait for 2 weeks before heading back to America. If they didn't return by then, he would assume they had failed. The group hiked inland, moving through valleys and forests. They saw signs of Vex activity in the distance, but none nearby. Susan's theory seemed to be holding true. The Vex avoided the highlands. On the third day, they were walking through a narrow valley when suddenly people surrounded them. They carried old rifles and wore simple clothes. One woman stepped forward. She had red hair and fierce eyes. "Who are you and why are you here?" she demanded. John held up his hands. "I'm John Miller. This is Susan Wright and Paul Bennett. We're Americans. We came to find help against the Vex." The woman studied them carefully. "I'm Maura Duncan. We don't get many visitors these days, especially not Americans." Susan explained their theory about the bagpipes and the Vex. As she talked, Moira's expression changed from suspicion to interest. "You might be onto something," Moira said when Susan finished. "The monsters don't come up here. We thought it was just because there aren't many people, but maybe there's more to it." Moira led them to a small village hidden in the hills. About 50 people lived there, in stone houses built long ago. They grew food in small gardens and kept sheep on the hillsides. They had managed to stay free when most of the world fell. "My brother Ian should hear this," Moira said. "He was in the army before all this, special forces, and he plays the pipes better than anyone around here." Ian Duncan was a tall man with a weathered face. He listened carefully to their theory, then nodded slowly. "It makes sense," he said. "When I still had radio contact with other units, I heard reports that the aliens seemed disoriented during a Highland Regiment parade. They were testing their equipment, playing the pipes, when a Vex patrol stumbled upon them. The aliens retreated immediately. Ian took them to his house and brought out his bagpipes. "Let's test this properly." That night, they set up equipment Paul had built to measure the Vex communication frequencies. Ian played different tunes on his pipes while Paul recorded the sound waves. "These patterns here," Paul said, pointing to his screen, "they match almost exactly with what we think disrupts the Vex neural systems." Ian smiled grimly. "My grandfather always said the pipes were a weapon. Guess he was more right than he knew." Over the next few days, word spread through the highlands. More people came to the village, bringing instruments and stories of their own encounters with the Vex. They learned that other mountain communities had survived too, hiding from the aliens. "We need to do more than just hide," John told them. "We need to fight back." Ian nodded. "The old ways might work best. My ancestors were Highland warriors who used the land against stronger enemies. We can do the same." They began to train. Ian taught them Highland fighting techniques, how to move quietly through rough terrain, how to use the landscape as a weapon. Moira organized people into small, mobile groups like the old clan raiding parties. The New Jacobites, Susan called them, fighting for freedom, just like before. After 2 weeks of training, the New Jacobites were ready for their first attack. They had spotted a small Vex outpost near Inverness. It was the perfect target to test their theory in a real fight. Ian led a group of 20 fighters, including John, Susan, and Paul. They carried a mix of old hunting rifles, farming tools turned into weapons, and 4 sets of bagpipes. Paul had also built small devices that could play recorded pipe music at high volume. They moved through the hills in the early morning mist, just as Highland warriors had done for centuries. The Vex outpost sat in a valley below them. 5 of the alien machines moved around a small building they had constructed. "Remember the plan," Ian whispered. "The pipers play first. When the Vex show signs of distress, we attack." The 4 pipers spread out around the valley. At Ian's signal, they began to play. The sound of Highland bagpipes filled the air, echoing off the hills. The ancient music of war flowed down into the valley. The effect on the Vex was immediate. The aliens began to move erratically, their mechanical limbs twitching. They seemed confused, turning in circles and bumping into each other. "Now," Ian shouted, and the fighters charged down the hill. The Vex tried to defend themselves, but their movements were slow and uncoordinated. Their energy weapons fired wildly, missing the humans. The new Jacobites struck fast and hard. They smashed the alien machines with makeshift clubs and axes. They shot the confused Vex with their rifles. In less than 10 minutes, the battle was over. 4 Vex lay destroyed. The 5th was damaged but still moving. "Keep that one alive," Susan called out. "We need to study it." Paul activated one of his devices, playing the pipe music directly at the damaged Vex. The alien froze completely, unable to move. They searched the outpost and found maps showing Vex positions across Scotland. They also found strange equipment that none of them understood. "This was too easy," John said, looking at the destroyed Vex. "They had no defense against the pipes at all." Ian nodded. "But they'll adapt. They'll figure out what we're doing and find a way to fight back. We need to move quickly while we have the advantage." They carried the damaged Vex and the alien equipment back to their village. Paul set up a makeshift lab to study their prisoner. He worked day and night, trying to understand how the Vex communicated and why the bagpipes affected them so strongly. After 3 days, he called everyone together. "I figured it out," he said, pointing to a diagram he had drawn. "The Vex are silicon-based life forms, like we thought, but they're also connected to each other through a network. The sound frequencies from the bagpipes disrupt both their bodies and their connection to the network." Susan studied the diagram. "So they're not just individual aliens. They're parts of a larger system." "Exactly," Paul said. "And I think I can use this knowledge to build better weapons. Devices that target their network directly." Word of their victory spread quickly. Other resistance groups in the mountains sent messengers to learn their techniques. Within a week, they had visitors from communities in the Cairngorms, the Grampians, and even as far as the Isle of Skye. A woman named Linda arrived from America. She had crossed the ocean after hearing rumors about the Scottish resistance. "I'm from the Appalachian Mountains," she told them. "We've been holding out there, but just barely. We need your help." John showed Linda the recordings of the bagpipes and explained how they affected the Vex. "We can send this information back with you," he said. "Mountain communities everywhere can use these techniques." But before Linda could return to America, they received alarming news. The Vex were moving a large force toward the Highlands. Hundreds of the alien machines were heading their way, more than they could hope to fight. "They know what we did," Ian said grimly. "They're coming to wipe us out." Susan looked at the maps they had taken from the outpost. "We need to set a trap, use their numbers against them, just like the old Highland clans did." John nodded. "We'll make our stand at Glencoe, the place where the Highlands have seen battle before." Glencoe was a place of dark history. Hundreds of years ago, the MacDonald clan was killed here by their own guests. Now it would see a different kind of battle. The new Jacobites worked quickly to prepare their trap. They had only 2 days before the Vex force would arrive. Every person had a job to do. Some dug hidden pits in the valley floor. Others placed speakers that Paul had built to play bagpipe music at high volume. The pipers practiced new tunes that Paul had found were even more effective against the Vex. "We captured radio signals from the Vex mothership," Susan told John as they worked. They're confused by what's happening. They don't understand how humans are suddenly fighting back. John smiled. The best weapon is one your enemy doesn't understand. On the morning of the battle, fog filled the valley. This was part of their plan too. The Vex sensors worked poorly in thick fog. The new Jacobites took their positions along the hillsides, hidden behind rocks and trees. 200 fighters from all across the highlands had joined them. Ian stood with the pipers on a ledge overlooking the valley. Remember, he told them, play with all your heart. Today we fight for Earth. The ground began to shake as the Vex force approached. Through the fog, they saw shapes moving. Hundreds of the alien machines marched in tight formation. Wait, Ian whispered. Let them get into the center of the valley. The Vex moved deeper into Glencoe, their metal feet echoing against the rocky ground. When the entire force was in the valley, Ian gave the signal. The pipers began to play. The music was joined by Paul's speakers hidden throughout the valley. The sound bounced off the steep valley walls, becoming louder and more powerful. The effect on the Vex was immediate. The front ranks stopped moving. Some began to twitch and shake. Others turned and bumped into the machines behind them. Now, Ian shouted. The new Jacobites attacked from all sides. They fired their weapons and rolled boulders down the steep hillsides. The Vex tried to fight back, but the music disrupted their ability to coordinate. Many Vex fell into the hidden pits. Others were crushed by boulders or shot by the human fighters. The battle was chaotic, but the humans had the advantage of knowing the terrain and being unaffected by the music. In the middle of the fight, something unexpected happened. A larger Vex machine appeared, different from the others. It moved through the confused Vex ranks, seemingly unaffected by the bagpipe music. It must be shielded somehow. Susan shouted to John. They've adapted. The new Vex fired a powerful energy beam that destroyed one of Paul's speakers. Then it turned toward the pipers on the ledge. John ran toward the ledge, knowing they had to protect the pipers at all costs. But he was too far away. The large Vex aimed its weapon at the pipers. Just as it fired, Ian threw himself in front of the others. The energy beam hit him directly. Ian. Moira screamed from her position nearby. Despite losing Ian, the pipers kept playing. The music seemed to grow even more powerful, filled with grief and rage. John reached the ledge and grabbed a fallen fighter's weapon. He fired at the large Vex, aiming for what looked like sensor arrays on its head. Other fighters joined him, concentrating their fire on the same spot. The large Vex's shield began to flicker. The music from the bagpipes seemed to be weakening it, even if more slowly than the regular Vex. With a final burst of gunfire, the humans broke through the shield. The large Vex collapsed, its lights going dark. Without their new leader, the remaining Vex fell into complete disarray. Some fled the valley, while others simply shut down where they stood. As the last of the Vex were defeated, Moira knelt beside her brother's body. He died as a true Highlander, she said, tears in her eyes. John put his hand on her shoulder. His sacrifice saved many lives today. After the battle, they counted their losses. 15 humans had died, including Ian, but they had destroyed over 300 Vex. Paul examined the remains of the large Vex. They're learning, he said grimly. This one had special shielding against our sound frequencies. The next ones will be even harder to kill. Susan nodded. But we learned something too. Even their shielded units are affected by the music if it's strong enough and played long enough. John looked up at the sky, knowing the Vex mothership was up there. We need to take this fight to them, he said, before they can build more shielded units. Moira stood up, wiping away her tears. Ian would want us to keep fighting. So how do we get to their ship? Paul smiled for the first time since the battle ended. I think I know a way. Paul's plan was dangerous but simple. After studying the captured Vex technology, he believed they could use a small Vex ship to reach the mothership. During the battle, we captured an undamaged Vex transport, he explained, pointing to the small ship they had hidden in a cave. I think I can make it work. And more importantly, I think I can make the mothership believe we belong there. Susan studied the alien ship with doubt in her eyes. Even if we get on board, what then? The mothership must have thousands of Vex. John laid out a map he had drawn based on information from the captured Vex. According to what we've learned, the mothership has a central control system. If we can play the bagpipe frequencies there, we might disrupt the entire Vex network. It's a suicide mission, Moira said quietly. John nodded. Probably. But we're running out of options. Our victory at Glencoe was big, but the Vex are sending reinforcements from space. They're building more shielded units. Soon our advantage will be gone. They spent a week preparing. Paul worked on the captured ship, figuring out how to fly it and how to fool the mothership's security. Linda used their radio to send the bagpipe information to resistance groups worldwide. If the mission failed, at least others would have the knowledge to keep fighting. Susan helped Paul build a special device. It looked like a small metal box with pipes sticking out of it. What is that? John asked. We're calling it the Great Highland Charge, Susan replied. It combines all the most effective frequencies we found. It's much stronger than the regular bagpipes. If we can activate this in the mothership's control center, it should disrupt their entire system. The night before the mission, the Highlanders held a ceremony for those who would go. John, Susan, Paul, Moira, and 3 pipers named Callum, Aileen, and Hamish. The pipers played ancient tunes of battle and remembrance. Everyone ate and drank together one last time. Nobody said it might be the last night on Earth for the volunteers, but everyone knew. At dawn, they boarded the Vex transport. It was cramped inside. The ship was made for Vex, not humans. Paul sat at what looked like the control area. I think I pressed this to start it, he said, touching the glowing panel. The ship hummed to life. It rose shakily from the ground, and then shot upward into the sky. Through small windows, they watched Earth grow smaller below them. It's working, Paul said, surprised. The mothership is sending us landing instructions. They think we're one of them. The massive Vex mothership filled their view. It was the size of a city, a metal world floating in space. They saw an opening appear in its side. Everyone ready? John asked, checking his weapon. The others nodded grimly. Paul guided the ship into the opening. They landed in a huge bay filled with similar vessels. Vex moved around, ignoring their ship. The disguise is working, Susan whispered. They can't tell we're not Vex. Using maps they had studied, they made their way through the mothership's corridors. Twice they had to hide from Vex patrols. Once they almost took a wrong turn. But finally, they'd reached a large door that matched their information for the control center. This is it, John said. Once we go in, there's no turning back. Moira checked the Great Highland Charge device. It's ready, but we'll need to defend it for 5 minutes while it builds to full power. They looked at each other, these unlikely warriors from Earth. They had come so far, from the first days of the invasion to this moment, ready to strike at the heart of the enemy. For Ion, Moira said. For Earth, the others replied. Paul pressed a panel beside the door. It slid open, revealing a vast chamber. In the center stood a tall structure made of glowing crystals. Dozens of Vex moved around it. The aliens turned as the humans entered. For a moment, everything was still. Then John raised his weapon and shouted the ancient Highland battle cry. Alba Gu Breath. Scotland forever. The final battle began. The control room erupted into chaos. The Vex moved toward the humans with their weapons ready. John, Moira, and the others spread out, firing their guns at the aliens. Get the device to the crystal structure, John shouted to Susan. Susan and Paul ran toward the center of the room, carrying the Great Highland Charge. Vex blocked their path, but Moira cleared the way with well-aimed shots. Here, Paul yelled when they reached the crystal structure. He set down the device and began pressing buttons to activate it. Cover me. I need 5 minutes. The 3 pipers, Callum, Aileen, and Hamish, took positions around Paul and Susan. They began to play their bagpipes. Even without the special device, the music had an effect. The nearest Vex slowed down, their movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. John and Moira fought desperately to keep the other Vex back. The aliens kept coming, pushing closer despite the disruption from the pipes. 2 minutes down, 3 to go, Paul called out. A large door on the far side of the room opened. More Vex poured in, including 3 of the shielded units they had faced at Glencoe. These moved steadily, despite the bagpipe music. "We can't hold them all," Moira shouted, reloading her weapon. John looked around frantically for something to help them. He noticed the crystal structure had what looked like control panels around its base. "Susan, the panels. Can you use them?" Susan dropped to her knees beside one of the panels. She had studied the Vex language and technology for months. Her fingers moved over the alien symbols. "I think I can lock the doors," she said. After a few more seconds, the large door slid shut, cutting off the flow of reinforcements. But the Vex already in the room were still coming. The shielded units were getting closer to the Pipers. One reached out and grabbed Hamish, throwing him across the room. His pipes went silent as he hit the wall hard. 60 more seconds, Paul shouted, his voice trained. Callum and Aileen played louder, their faces red with effort. The music echoed through the control room, bouncing off the metal walls. John and Moira fought their way to the fallen Hamish and dragged him back toward the others. He was hurt but alive. 30 seconds, Paul called. The shielded Vex were just steps away now. One raised its weapon toward Paul and the device. Moira threw herself forward, firing her last bullets at the Vex's head. The shots bounced off its shield, but the alien turned toward her instead. 10 seconds, Paul shouted. John fired at the feet of the shielded Vex, where he had noticed the shields seemed weaker. The alien stumbled, but kept coming. 5, 4, 3. The shielded Vex reached for the device. 2, 1. Paul slammed his hand down on the final button. The great Highland charge activated with a deep, powerful sound. It was like 100 bagpipes playing at once, but deeper and stronger than any human instrument could produce. The effect was instant and dramatic. Every Vex in the room froze. The crystal structure began to vibrate. Cracks appeared in its surface. "It's working," Susan shouted over the noise. "The frequency is disrupting their entire network." On screens around the room, they could see other parts of the mothership. Vex everywhere were freezing or moving erratically. Systems were shutting down. "We need to get out of here," John said, helping Hamish to his feet. "This whole place might come apart." They fought their way back to the bay where they had left their ship. Vex lay motionless throughout the corridors. The great Highland charge's effect was spreading through the entire mothership. As they reached their ship, the walls around them began to shake. Lights flickered and went out. Paul quickly started the ship's engines. They lifted off just as the floor beneath them began to crack. They flew out of the bay and away from the mothership. Behind them, the massive alien vessel was breaking apart. Explosions rippled across its surface. Smaller Vex ships nearby were also affected, spinning out of control or shutting down completely. "The network," Susan said, watching the destruction. "They were all connected. When we disrupted the main control, it affected all of them." They flew back to Earth in silence, exhausted but alive. As they entered the atmosphere, they picked up radio signals from around the world. Everywhere, people were reporting the same thing. The Vex were falling, their invasion collapsing. 6 months later, John stood on a hill overlooking Edinburgh. The city was still damaged from the invasion, but people were rebuilding. In the distance, bagpipes played. "We did it," Susan said, standing beside him. "Humanity survived." Moira joined them, looking up at the sky. "Ian would be proud." John nodded. "And now we know we're not alone in the universe. There might be other threats out there." "If they come," Susan said, "we'll be ready. The Highland way worked once. It will work again. Below them, in what was once Edinburgh Castle, people from all over the world were gathering. They came to learn Highland tactics, to study the Vex technology, and to prepare for whatever might come next. The bagpipes played on, both a celebration of victory and a promise. Earth would always find a way to fight back.